It felt good to walk in the shade of the 2 oak trees. Stanley wondered if this is how a condemned man felt on his way to the electric chair, appreciating all the good things in life for the last time. They had to step around holes to get to the cabin door. Stanley was surprised to see so many around the cabin. He would have expected the warden to not want the campers digging so close to her home. But several holes were right up against the cabin wall. The holes were closer together here as well, and were of different shapes and sizes. Mr. Sir knocked on the door. Stanley still held the empty sack. "Yes," the warden said, opening the door. "There's been a little trouble out on the lake," Mr. Sir said. "Caveman will tell you all about it." The warden stared at Mr. Sir a moment, then her gaze turned toward Stanley. He felt nothing but dread now. "Come in, I suppose," said the warden. "You're letting the cold out." It was air-conditioned inside her cabin. The television was going. She picked up the remote and turned it off. She sat down on a canvas chair. She was barefoot and wearing shorts. Her legs were freckled as her face and arms. "So what is it you have to tell me?" Stanley took a breath to steady himself. While Mr. Sir was filling the canteens, I snuck into the trunk and stole his sack of sunflower seeds. "I see." She turned to Mrs. Sir. "That's why you brought him here?" "Yes, but I think he's lying. I think someone else stole the sack. A caveman is covering up for X-ray or somebody. It was a 20-pound sack, and he claims to have eaten them all by himself." He took the sack from Stanley and handed it to the warden. "I see," the warden said again. "The sack wasn't full," said Stanley, "and I spilled a lot. You can check my hole." "In that room, caveman, there's a small flower case. Will you get it for me, please?" She pointed to a door. Stanley looked at the door, then at the warden, then back at the door. He slowly walked to it. It was kind of a dressing room with a sink and a mirror. Next to the sink, he saw the case, white with pink roses. He brought it back to the warden. She led out and set it out, and she set it out on the glass table in front of her. She unclasped the latch and opened the case. It was a makeup case. Stanley's mother had one similar to it. He saw several bottles of nail polish remover, a couple of lipstick tubes, and then other jars and powders. The warden held up a small jar of dark red polish. "You see this, caveman?" He nodded. "This is my special polish. Do you see the dark, rich color? You can't buy that in a store. I have to make it myself." Stanley had no idea why she was showing it to him. He wondered why the warden would ever have the need to wear nail polish or makeup. "You want to know my secret ingredient?" He raised and lowered one shoulder. The warden opened the bottle. "Rattlesnake venom." With a small paintbrush, she began applying it to the nails on her left hand. "It's perfectly harmless when it's dry." She finished her left hand. She waved it in the air for a few seconds, then began painting the nails on her right hand. "It's only toxic while it's wet." She finished painting her nails, then stood up. She reached over and touched Stanley's face with her fingers. She ran her sharp, wet nails gently across his cheek. He felt his skin tingle. The polish on her pinky just barely touched the wound behind his ear. A sharp sting of pain caused him to jump back. The warden turned to face Mr. Sir, who was sitting on the fireplace hearth. "So you think he stole your sunflower seeds?" "No, he says he stole them, but I think it was." She stepped toward him and struck him across the face. Mr. Sir stared at her. He had 3 long red marks slanting across the left side of his face. Stanley didn't know if the red marks were caused by her nail polish or his blood. It took a moment for the venom to sink in. Suddenly, Mr. Sir screamed and clutched his face with both hands. He let himself fall over, rolling off the hearth and onto the rug. The warden spoke softly. "I don't especially care about your sunflower seeds." Mr. Sir moaned. "If you must know," said the warden, "I liked it better when you smoked." For a second, Mr. Sir's pain seemed to recede. He took several long, deep breaths. Then his head jerked back violently, and he let out a shrill scream, worse than the one before. The warden turned to Stanley. "I suggest you go back to your hole now." Stanley started to go, but Mr. Sir lay in the way. Stanley could see the muscles of his face jump and twitch. His body writhed in agony. Stanley stepped carefully over him. "Is he—" "Excuse me," said the warden. Stanley was too frightened to speak. "He's not going to die," the warden said, "unfortunately for you." It was a long walk back to his hole. Stanley looked out through the haze of heat and dirt at the other boys lowering and raising their shovels. Group D was the farthest away. He realized that once again he would be digging long after everyone else had quit. He'd hoped he'd finished before Mr. Sir recovered. He didn't want to be out there alone with Mr. Sir. He won't die, the warden had said, unfortunately for you. Walking across the desolate wasteland, Stanley thought about his great-grandfather. Not the pig stealer, but the pig stealer's son, the one who was robbed by Kiss and Kate Barlow. He tried to imagine how he must have felt after Kiss and Kate had left him stranded in the desert. It probably wasn't a whole lot different than the way he himself felt now. Kate Barlow had left his great-grandfather to face the hot, barren desert. The warden had left Stanley to face Mr. Sir. Somehow, his great-grandfather had survived for 17 days before he was rescued by a couple of rattlesnake hunters. He was insane when they found him. When he was asked how he lived so long, he said, "He found refuge on God's thumb." He spent nearly a month in the hospital. He ended up marrying one of the nurses. Nobody ever knew what he meant by God's thumb, including himself. Stanley heard a twitching sound. He stopped in mid-step with one foot in the air. A rattlesnake lay coiled beneath his foot. Its tail was pointed upward, rattling. Stanley backed his leg away, then turned and ran. The rattlesnake didn't chase after him. It had rattled its tail to warn him to stay away. "Thanks for the warning," Stanley whispered as his heart pounded. The rattlesnake would be a lot more dangerous if it didn't have a rattle. "Hey, caveman," called Armpit, "you're still alive." "What did the warden say?" asked Estrie. "What did you tell her?" said Magnet. "I told her I stole the seat," said Stanley. "Good going," said Magnet. "What'd she do?" said Zigzag. Stanley shrugged one shoulder. "Nothing. She got mad at Mr. Sir for bothering her." He didn't feel like going into the details. If he didn't talk about it, then maybe it didn't happen. He went over to his hole, and to his surprise, it was nearly finished. He stared at it, amazed. It didn't make sense. Perhaps it did. He smiled. Since he had taken the blame for the sunflower seeds, he realized that the other boys had dug his hole for him. "Hey, thanks," he said. "Don't look at me," said X-Ray. Confused, Stanley looked around from Magnet to Armpit to Zigzag to Squid. Not one of them took credit for it. Then he turned to Zero, who had been quietly digging in his hole ever since Stanley's return. Zero's hole was smaller than all the others. Stanley was the first one finished. He spat in his hole, then showered and changed into his cleaner set of clothes. It had been 3 days since the laundry was done, so even his clean set was dirty and smelly. Tomorrow these would become his work clothes, and his other set would be washed. He could think of no reason why Zero would dig his hole for him. Zero didn't even get any sunflower seeds. "I guess he likes to dig holes," Armpit has said. "He's a mole," said Zigzag. "I think he eats dirt." "Moles don't eat dirt," X-Ray had pointed out. "Worms eat dirt." "Hey, Zero," Squid had asked, "are you a mole or a worm?" Zero had said nothing. Stanley never even thanked him, but now, as he sat on his cot, he waited for Zero to return from the shower room. "Thanks," he said to Zero, as Zero entered through the tent flap. Zero glanced at him, then went over to the crates where he deposited his dirty clothes and towel. "Why'd you help me?" Stanley asked. Zero turned to him. "You didn't steal the sunflower seeds," he said. "So neither did you," said Stanley. Zero stared at him. His eyes seemed to expand, and it was almost as if Zero was looking through him. "You didn't steal the sneakers," he said. Stanley said nothing. He watched Zero walk out of the tent. If anybody had X-ray vision, it was Zero. "Wait," he called, then hurried out after him. Zero had stopped just outside the tent as Stanley almost ran into him. "I'll try to teach you to read if you want," Stanley offered. "I don't know if I know how to teach, but I'm not worn out today since you dug a lot of my hole." A big smile spread across Zero's face. They returned to the tent, where they were less likely to be bothered. Stanley got his box of stationery and a pen out of his crate. They sat on the ground. "Do you know the alphabet?" Stanley asked. For a second, he thought he saw a flash of defiance in Zero's eye, but then it passed. "I think I know some of it," Zero said. "A, B, C, D. "Keep going," said Stanley. Zero's eyes looked upward. "E, F," said Stanley. "G," said Zero. He blew some air out of the side of his face. "H-I-K-P? "H-I-J-K-L," said Stanley. "That's right," said Zero. I've heard it before, I just don't have it memorized exactly. That's all right, said Stanley. Here, I'll say the whole thing just to kind of refresh your memory, then you can try it. He recited the alphabet for Zero. Then Zero repeated it without a single mistake. Not bad for a kid who'd never seen Sesame Street. Well, I've heard it before somewhere, Zero said, trying to act like it was nothing, but his smile gave him away. The next step was harder. Stanley had to figure out how to teach him to recognize each letter. He gave Zero a piece of paper and a piece for himself. I guess we'll start with A. He printed a capital A. Then Zero copied it onto a sheet of paper. The paper wasn't lined, which made it more difficult, but Zero's A wasn't bad, just a little big. Stanley told him he needed to write a little smaller, or else he'd run out of paper real quick. Zero printed it smaller. Actually, there are 2 ways to write each letter, Stanley said as he realized this was going to be even harder than he had thought. There's a capital A, but usually you'll see a small a. You only have capitals at the beginning of a word and only if it's at the start of a sentence, or if it's a proper noun like a name. Zero nodded as if he understood, but Stanley knew he had made very little sense. He printed a lower A and Zero copied it. So there are 52, said Zero. Stanley didn't know what he was talking about. Instead of 26 letters, there are really 52. Stanley looked at him surprised. I guess that's right. How'd you figure that out, he asked. Zero said nothing. Did you add? Zero said nothing. Did you multiply? That's just how many there are, said Zero. Stanley raised and lowered one shoulder. He didn't even know how Zero knew there were 26 in the first place. Did he count them as he recited them? He had Zero write a few more upper and lowercase a's, and then he moved on to a capital B. This is going to take a long time, he realized. You can teach me 10 letters a day, suggested Zero, 5 capitals and 5 smalls. After 5 days, I'll know them all, except on the last day I'll have to write 12, 6 capitals and 6 smalls. Again, Stanley stared at him, amazed that he was able to figure all that out. Zero must have thought he was staring for a different reason, because he said, I'll dig part of your hole every day. I can dig for about an hour, then you can teach me for an hour. And since I'm a faster digger anyway, our holes will get done about the same time. I won't have to wait for you. Okay, Stanley agreed. As Zero was printing his B's, Stanley asked him how he figured out it would take 5 days. Did you multiply? Did you divide? That's just what it is, Zero said. It's good math, said Stanley. I'm not stupid, said Zero. I know everybody thinks I am. I just don't like answering their questions. Later that night, as he lay in his cot, Stanley reconsidered the deal he had made with Zero. Getting a break every day would be a relief, but he knew X-Ray wouldn't like it. He wondered if there might be a way for Zero to agree to dig part of X-Ray's hole as well. But then again, why should he? I'm the one teaching Zero. I need the break, so I'll have the energy to teach him. I'm the one who took the blame for the sunflower seeds. I'm the one who Mr. Sir is mad at. He closed his eyes, and images of the warden's cabin floated around his head. Her red fingernails, Mr. Sir writhing on the floor, her flowered makeup kit. He opened his eyes. He suddenly realized where he had seen the gold tube before. He'd seen it in his mother's bathroom, and he'd seen it again in the warden's cabin. It was half of a lipstick container. KB. KB. He felt a jolt of astonishment. His mouth silently formed the name Kate Parlow, as he wondered if it really could have belonged to the kissin' outlaw. See you guys next week.